Hi students, and welcome to video 3 in our 5-part series on the first lecture of Lewis structures. So in the previous videos, we went over how to calculate the steric number, and then we used that steric number to find the shape of CO2, which was linear. So now we're going to use this information to come up with the formal Lewis structure of CO2. And in this process, we'll be going over the octet rule and formal charge. So on the bottom left, you'll see there are a list of steps. And these are the steps that you can use whenever you're calculating or trying to come up with a formal Lewis structure. So in the previous videos, we identified the central atom and calculated the steric number. So now we're starting with step 3, which is connecting all the atoms with a single bond. So how do we know where to place the atoms? Well, from this picture, we knew that the molecular shape was linear. So what we're going to do is we're going to place the atoms in the framework that's listed for us on the picture. So we're going to put the carbon, the central atom, in the center where the red dot is. And then we're going to put the 2 oxygens where the 2 green dots are on the framework. And then, as it says in the steps, we're going to connect all of the atoms with a single bond. So now let's move on to step number 4, which is fulfilling the octet rule for the central atom. Before we get to that, we should talk about what the octet rule is. So the octet rule is the rule that every atom should have 8 surrounding electrons. And every bond counts as 2 electrons. So currently the carbon has 2 bonds, 1 to each of the oxygens, so 4 electrons total. Now we need to get it up to having 8 surrounding electrons. So in this case, the way that we're going to do that is by adding double bonds to each of the oxygens. Now we have fulfilled step 4. And just as a note here, you're always going to try to fulfill the octet rule after fulfilling the steric number. So steric number comes first. You need to make sure that that is correct, and then you move on to octet rule. Now that we've fulfilled the octet rule for the central atom, we can move to step 5, which is fulfilling the octet rule for the peripheral atoms. So each of the oxygens only has 2 bonds to the carbon. So each of the oxygens has just 4 electrons total, and we need to get it up to 8. So we're going to do this by adding lone electron pairs around both of the oxygens until they have 8 electrons total. We've now fulfilled step 5. And then step 6 is to minimize formal charges. So what is formal charge? Formal charge can be calculated as the number of valence electrons of the atom minus, in parentheticals, the number of bonds plus the number of lone electrons. Notice that I said lone electrons and not lone electron pairs. So 1 lone electron pair counts as 2 lone electrons, and then the number of bonds is self-explanatory. So now let's calculate the formal charge for the carbon in the structure. So for carbon, it started with 4 valence electrons. It has made 4 bonds, and it has 0 lone electrons. So its formal charge is 0. And then the 2 oxygens are equivalent. They have the same number of bonds and the same number of lone electrons. So they will both have the same formal charge. They start with 6 valence electrons. They each have 2 bonds and 4 lone electrons because they have 2 lone electron pairs. So their formal charge is also 0. So we've minimized formal charges in this structure. Now let's talk about 2 of the common ways in which students can go wrong here. So first, there are multiple ways to fulfill the octet rule. So one way a student might try to fulfill the octet rule for the central atom is by simply adding lone electron pairs around the carbon. However, this would be incorrect because now this no longer fulfills the steric number for the carbon, because in this Lewis structure, it has 4 electron domains around it. 2 for the bonds, and then 2 for the lone electron pairs. So this would not fulfill the steric number, and because steric number is more important than octet rule, this would be the incorrect structure. Another way in which students could go wrong here is by drawing the following structure, where they have a triple bond to one oxygen and a single bond to the other oxygen. Now, why is this incorrect? So the carbon still has a steric number of 2, but the oxygens have formal charges on them. So the oxygen with only one bond has a formal charge of -1, and the oxygen with the triple bond has a formal charge of +1 if you use the formula above. So that does not minimize formal charges, which is why it would be the incorrect structure. Okay, and with that, we are going to use these steps for finding the Lewis structure of a compound in order to solve some other problems.